Hello and welcome to an unusually international episode of the Of Interest podcast. I'm Dan Brunskill and I'm broadcasting to you from Brussels, Belgium, and I will be joined today by a very special guest from Beijing, China. David Mahon is the founder and executive chairman of Mahon China Investment Management. He has lived and worked in China for most of his career. We will discuss how China is coping with the economic shock from the war in Iran and whether New Zealand's strengthening ties with the United States puts our free trade agreement with China at risk. David, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Daniel. It's a great privilege. Your paper is really important, so thank you very much.
Could you start by telling us a little about yourself and what it is that you and your business does in China?
Yes, the company is a small business. We have an office in Auckland. We have one in Ningbo near Shanghai and also in London. I'm in Beijing with 5 of my team members, and we are a representative is about to start in Paris in 2 months. We've got clients like Fonterra has been a client for 20 years, 16 years, Esprit, Les Mills, and we have a group of other, I suppose, iconic New Zealand companies.
It feels like as a New Zealander or as a Westerner, it can be quite hard to understand the China economy. It's quite a different system. Some of the data is a bit opaque. Is a big part of what you do just bridging the gap or interpreting the differences between a Western business and the China market?
Interpreting economic trends, and particularly economic trends in specific sectors, has always been a major part of our business. In an emerging country like China, and China is both a developed and a developing market. The developed market is the 11 coastal provinces. Most of those key cities have a higher GDP per capita than Auckland, Sydney, Melbourne, and many European cities. And then you have the core of central China and then further north and west, where you could argue that is like a developing country in its own right. And that interaction is a dynamic which is unique in history. And it's an ongoing experiment, one which the Chinese government itself is uncertain of what the next 3 to 5 years might look like. So being involved in that is something where you're having to do your best to chart and track what's happening. So I think we do that, but I think all companies that are serious about China should also be doing it for themselves.
Okay, give us a bit of a readout then. What is the state of China's economy right now? Where is it looking strong? Where is it looking challenged? I know there was a lot of speculation sort of last year that China might significantly downgrade its growth target. Lots of Western economists felt like it wouldn't be able to achieve the 5%. And then I think it did lower its growth target a little bit, but kept it pretty close to 5%. How do you think the China economy in both speeds of it, both the developed and less developed parts of it, how do you think they are tracking right now?
If you take the entire economy, so we'll take all of China together, every significant year, the Western commentariat has got it wrong. Go way back, Asian financial crisis, dot-com bubble bursting, SARS, global financial crisis, and particularly COVID, the pandemic. I think the same could be said for most journalists. China is not as complicated as a lot of analysts or consultants, I would add, like to say it is. China is human, and China is governed by the laws of economics. China is governed by the laws of development. It's a place where you can actually grasp principle pretty well. And I think the factors that people have missed here is that China has been growing since it came out of its pandemic seclusion. The growth has been really significant. People were quavering over what will happen last year. China may not grow as well as it should, and we want Chinese to buy our products. And China grew at 5%. I don't quite get this. The days of glory of China are over. China has just crossed the threshold of its economic and cultural arising. And now it's on the leading edge of this great technological industrial revolution. I think the trouble is we see a beginning and end to the industrial revolution. And that revolution, that mechanization that began the process of efficient production, mass production, enhanced production, and a lifting away from humans of the burden of labor, that's in the late 18th century. And it's been going on ever since. It can't be cut off at any one time. But now it's in a virtual world, and it's a world of cognizance. So the growth has been maintained, but the engine of that growth has been deliberately shifted to something more sustainable than what went before.
From what was the growth previously and what is it now?
The growth previously was a more common process of manufacturing, the utilization of inexpensive labor. That changed about a decade ago, actually, in terms of the cost of labor, because it increased quite considerably because China was growing, its middle class was growing. It was a shift also away from what had become very much a housing or real estate driven economy, where banks' assets or mortgages in too great a number, and also the consumption and the investment that was driving much of the economy came from a weird mix of ordinary investment in housing and also the transfer of land in a country where all the tax goes to the center and then is reallocated. So each province, each city, each county is sort of forced to come up with their own means of income. And for decades, converting agricultural land into either industrial estates or residential real estate was the one way they could actually generate cash. So they were doing those activities to make enough money to run their cities, which meant there was an excess of real estate and a diminution of precious agricultural land. So that was quite an imbalance. And the government ended it deliberately, clumsily and belatedly, but it was an initiative from the government. And they began to restrict credit to the major property developments and the big development companies to slow things down. And it triggered a deflation and in some areas a collapse. But now you could argue the 35% that was real estate as a driver, that's now been replaced with smart manufacturing, high-tech companies in general. And now you can go to a lot of factories where there are no workers at all. The whole thing is robotic.
Okay, it would be nice if New Zealand could also transition from being a property investment-led economy to a high productivity manufacturing economy, but I won't hold my breath for that. Talk to me about how the China economy is coping with the fallout from the war on Iran, with the Strait of Hormuz closed and oil prices shooting up. That seems to be slowing our growth in New Zealand. It seems to be slowing global growth, and it's causing maybe more inflationary conditions in the US rather than recessionary. What's happening in China?
China had many reserves. Since I first came here in 1984, I was aware of the grain silos that were there just in case. Many of the reserves we don't know, they're state secrets. But we know there was in an excess of 260 days oil reserves when the first bombing of Iran took place. They have huge stores of fertilizer. They have a whole range of chemicals, including helium, which is very important in the tech sector and chip manufacturing. So China has tremendous buffers so far from the impact, although a lot of it hasn't hit yet, given the fact that a ceasefire seems now unlikely, and no one can see how America can untangle itself. China will eventually begin to feel the impact of the loss of trade through the Strait of Hormuz and the loss of production from the Arab Emirates, converting oil into all its crucial materials. That said, China is likely to be able to utilize the Strait of Hormuz in most cases. The Americans will not risk sinking Chinese tankers. Right. China is in a very strong position because of this. So it also has access to oil from Russia. I think we overestimate, or the global opinion overestimates how much that can ramp up. Russia actually, in the end, has limitations on how much it's got great reserves, but how much it can process in any quarter of a year means that China can't just turn to Russia. It has land access. It can bring oil by its Belt and Road railway system from Iran, and that's been stepped up considerably. And it's interesting, the Chinese perspective here is that America's waging a trade war and a war of containment and embargo against China, which I believe is true. And I think it's something that began with Bill Clinton. This approach to containment is partly the attack on Venezuela and the abduction of President Maduro, because Venezuela was a major supplier of oil to China. That was an attempt to block China's access to oil. I'm not saying it was the only motive for the attack on Venezuela, but at the same time, it was part of the thinking. And again, when people look at the attack on Iran by Israel and America, again, the Chinese perceive this as another move by the US to deny them energy resources they need because they don't have great resources of oil themselves. If it goes on longer, it will affect China's reserves. Fertilizer, for instance, crucial for late spring planting, which was when the war hit. But you need fertilizer right throughout the season, and you're putting it on your crops and fields all the way through till, the fallow months of winter. And that's a big issue here if the war continues. But the other one, the last bit is, this is going to diminish the ability of China's trade partners to take its products. As their economies struggle, it's not going to sell the same volume of stuff that it used to sell, or even its imports. China depends on a huge spectrum of inputs, widgets, components in the electronics sector. It depends on copper and tungsten. It depends on petroleum. China is also still importing a lot of LNG. So there's a whole array of things. Protein, New Zealand's sale of dairy ingredients, despite China reaching around 80% self-reliance in the dairy sector, the top end and the infant formula sector, food services, these are really important. So China can't afford for the suppliers that it currently depends upon to have weaker economies. So Iran affects China in an array of different ways.
Since China is such a big buyer of Iranian oil and they have, some sort of diplomatic relationship, is China involved in trying to negotiate a ceasefire or find some sort of resolution to the problem?
It's very hard through a Western perspective, which all of us have,
Yeah.
China has a very different diplomatic history, and not just since the revolution in 1949, but you go back through the major dynasties of China, there is a particular tone and style of diplomacy. So you've got a very interesting position. China doesn't tell other countries what to do. It doesn't get involved in driving a wedge between combatants. It brokers peace where it has an opportunity, but that opportunity is when the other sides are willing to. What I'm hearing is there's a lot of activity. There are a lot of conversations, as is Delhi and Moscow. So I think there's a triad there that we're not hearing about, but is quite a more active conversation than would have usually taken place.
It's interesting to hear you say that China doesn't tell other countries what to do, because I think the fear for New Zealand or other Western countries is that if China was unchecked in its power, it would boss us around. And the idea of having sort of a military partnership with the US and other sort of NATO-aligned countries is that then there's a counterbalance that insulates us from being bossed around by China. But you don't seem to see it that way. You don't see a risk that China would want to dominate us or control us.
New Zealand has been allowing itself to be bossed around since the first European put its foot on New Zealand soil. England, we did its bidding in every way. We went out of our way to avoid upsetting it. We're in huge support. We thought of ourselves as being overseas British. Post the Second World War, it was the United States. We went to the Vietnam War. We engaged in a number of conflicts. And recently, forgetting the legacy of Helen Clark not taking us to Iraq, we are deepening our relationship strategically with Washington when the abduction of Maduro is a total violation of international law. The blowing up of ships in the Caribbean because they might be smuggling drugs is an act of murder, and killing sailors in the water afterwards is a war crime. Bombing the civilian infrastructure of Iran is a war crime. And we have said almost nothing. On the contrary, we are tacitly supporting the American-Israeli idea of what works in Gaza. Therefore, we are helping chaperone a genocide. So I think we have to be realistic about where we have stood. The strength that has actually nonetheless come through New Zealand culture in the last 40 years, and I would say Helen Clark and John Key and Bill English's terms were remarkable in the non-allied stance they managed to keep. New Zealand has an opportunity, because of the demise of the American empire, to be non-allied again. And we make it very clear we are not joining AUKUS, we are not rejoining ANZUS. We should be non-allied. And then taking a stance now, we do it from strength. So when China tells us we should do this or that, or how we should respond to something, we can also stand up to China. 8% of the world's population was so-called the West, and now we are clearly back that the majority of the world's population, 60% or more, are in Asia. And China already is the hegemon economically in Asia. I don't think our choices are easy, but I think they are simple. Go back to our non-allied stance.
Do you generally think China is a good neighbour? Because if you look at its relationship with a lot of countries on its border, that relationship is often pretty poor. It has a bad relationship with India, with Vietnam, with Japan, with the Philippines. Obviously, we do not share a border with China, but do you really think that we would have such a good relationship if it was not counterbalanced?
Yes, because we are not a neighbour of China's.
Right.
And we have to share the history of each of these relationships. With Japan, the history of Japan and the Second World War in China was unbelievable. Vietnam has been a very bad relationship for about 1,000, 2,000 years. And it was a bit bumpy after the end of the Vietnam War. Now they have an excellent relationship, a credit to both governments. And for the rest of Asia, things are pretty good. It's just one of those situations where a very big country like China is going to have difficult relationships with many of its neighbors. But this isn't a definition of the character of China. It's to do with historical circumstances and geographical circumstances and the fact it's now economically strong. So New Zealand is so far away from China physically, geographically, that if we embrace the tremendous trade we have with China, there are great opportunities. And China is not trying to export its communist system. This is not the Soviet Union. There's almost no examples of that. But big powers will always try and have people see things the way they see them. And they'll always put pressure on New Zealand. And anyone who is powerful in the world will do it to small countries. That's our lot. And we just have to learn how to stand up to it with diplomacy and strength.
Speaking of putting pressure on New Zealand, 4 New Zealand MPs have been given a 12-month travel ban by China, just in retaliation for visiting Taiwan, which is something parliamentarians have occasionally done. Do you think that is an example of the New Zealand-China relationship worsening? And is it not an example of China trying to pressure us in some way?
Why would New Zealand members of parliament go to a place that when we signed the free trade agreement, or in the 70s, when we recognized China diplomatically, we recognized one China. And that Taiwan was an inalienable part of China. However, that we all hoped, or we all had an aim for peaceful reconciliation of the differences. And we've played America's game. We've been a little silly nation trying to be important, going in and talking to the vice president of Taiwan. Of course, they were annoyed in Beijing. They've ignored it in previous years. So we're saying before there was a precedent set, before they saw New Zealand being so tenacious in its non-allied stance, it threw America some bones. They thought it was fine. But we've lost respect in Asia. Let's not worry about the deterioration of the future. New Zealand-China relations are at their worst stage since diplomatic recognition.
Wow.
And they're so bad that the Chinese have decided, and I think this is something which a number of officials have indicated, because of the last 40 years, we're going to wait till the next election. Because we know New Zealand, we know that there is deep integrity in many parts of New Zealand, but we should have no illusions. And if you look at our free trade agreement, the profit margin, the rationale for many of our companies trading with China is only based on the fact we pay no tax. If we had lost that free trade agreement, we would lose much of our business with China. We wouldn't compete with the rest of the world.
Do you think our free trade agreement is at risk at this point?
Not at this stage. I think the Chinese are patient. New Zealand has been an uncommonly objective Western country in its engagement with China since economic reform began. They respect that. If you notice how John Key and Helen Clark both went for the anniversary of the end of the war against Japan, the 80-year anniversary in Beijing last year, that was in the newspapers. That was very much focused on because of the history. And it is an unusual history.
It struck me when I was in China last year that many Kiwi businesses like you wish New Zealand was taking a more, shall we say, balanced line vis-a-vis China and the US trade and security. Let me read you a quote from a report which was published by the NZ Business Roundtable in Shanghai. One person writes, "The language used by governments when navigating geopolitical tensions can have real commercial consequences. Exporters consistently express the view that New Zealand's long-standing, pragmatic and independent approach to international engagement should continue." What sort of commercial consequences are they referring to there?
Ask the Australian wine and lobster industry or the coke and coal industry. Prime Minister Morrison decided that he would join America to beat up on China at the height of COVID, when Chinese were dying in their thousands. Not a good move. And so China basically retaliated, and it blocked a lot of things, including minerals. So China will make economic choices against its short-term interests if it believes that for its own dignity and for its own long-term strategic interests are worth doing. New Zealand sells a lot of things to China. None of them are irreplaceable. In the end, it's just milk. In the end, it's just fruit or honey. That's something that we need to acknowledge. At the moment, there's not some sword hanging over us, partly because China is so busy dealing with a massive geopolitical mess, as all great powers and smaller and medium-sized powers are. There are two things we could suffer. One is it would block what it doesn't need and start blocking something it considers a luxury. But at the same time, it may also get to a position where it's just indifferent towards New Zealand. And indifference is just as damaging because you can't negotiate back. That said, New Zealand's brand today is very high. In a country where our real market is not the 1.4 billion people, but it's probably a third of the 500 million middle class. They buy our products. They buy our wine, our lobster. They'll buy our health and beauty products. They'll spend money to come and be tourists in Queenstown or Waiheke Island or Bay of Islands. So those people are still seeing us as the premium country. It's clean, it's safe, good regulations. New Zealand's reliable in supplying food. What you put in your body or on your body, if it comes from New Zealand, no other country comes near the mana we have amongst consumers. And that's still there because consumers aren't sitting through these things and getting themselves into geopolitical hissy fits. But we can't take it for granted. We need to invest in that.
What is the state of New Zealand-China trade at the moment? Are New Zealand products still doing well in the China market?
I think the full trade is something like 30 billion, of which 20 billion is New Zealand shipments to China. So we've got a good surplus and it's pretty strong, but most of the areas we could be making a lot of money in, we're not. For instance, in Manuka honey, everyone went to China. They misled the consumer about content. I mean, the Chinese would joke. They looked online. They saw how much Manuka honey was produced a year, and an extra 40% was available on the Chinese market. So we've killed that category for now. Unfortunately, on the big numbers, wine looks great. Sauvignon Blanc is coming in, 12% growth, but it's being hollowed out because Marlborough is desperately oversupplied, and whole bladders of wine have been sent to be put into bottles, and Chinese distributors making up Maori names and going out as a commodity at 1/3 of the price they should command. Cloudy Bay still holds a premium position, which is good. Oyster Bay does quite well. So there's a premium spot there for us still in wine, but we always cannibalize our own markets once we get a bit of growth and we get margins coming in. So one of the other things is we have to now work in unity, learn from Zespri, become a voluntary market cooperative, whether it's seafood, particularly honey. It's probably too late, but I think we could still do it. And because of Zespri, we're quite safe with kiwi fruit. But you've got to be here as well. Even if you're a smallish business selling health and beauty products, have a couple of people in an office in Shanghai to help manage the marketing story, the New Zealand story that, often only New Zealand can tell so well.
Okay, so imagine Christopher Luxon gets on the phone with you tomorrow, or Chris Hipkins if he wins the election in November. They call you and they say, David, help me out. What am I supposed to do? I've got the US breathing down my neck. I want to keep trading with China. How do we manage this relationship? Because this is a difficult situation. It doesn't seem that simple to me. What would you advise the New Zealand government actually do?
We learn how to do nothing. It's not what we do, it's doing less. Don't say anything. Stop telling America and Canberra how we're wedded at the hip on their strategic position. Just stop showing off. Stop seeking the approval of these big countries that impress you so much, including Beijing. Don't be ingratiating. Show a little dignity. Be a small country that knows it has little political agency, but has its own self-respect. Show respect towards everybody. Let's just go back to being simple. A South Pacific nation that wants to confer the respect on other nations that we would like to have conferred on us. If something comes up that violates international law, whether it's China or Israel, speak out against it and call it for what it is. Because international law is still all a small country like New Zealand has. So I would advise anyone in politics, and I'm not involved myself, but what we need to do is less and have more modesty and just get on with the things that really count, which is fixing our domestic economy, alleviating the things, whether it's environmental, whether it's related to poverty, business confidence, all the things that government should be focusing on. And then by example, by what we are ourselves as a society and an economy, we'll get the respect of the world. We've done it in the past. That tremendous experiment of the independence of the Reserve Bank. We're the first in the world to do that. That was a bold move. If we do less and our need for the approval of other nations is less, then I think the navigation is going to be a lot simpler.
Okay, nice and simple. David Mahon, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for talking to us. It's a real pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Dan.